Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's 5th episode in our summer series, you will hear presentations from our conference, Menzies and the British Commonwealth of Nations. First presentation will be from Dan Brettig on Menzies cricket and the Cold War. The second is from Dr. Teesta Prakash on Menzies, Commonwealth and Kashmir. The third presentation is by Dr. Stewart Gill on Canada and Australia in the Commonwealth, Robert Menzies' relationship with Mackenzie King to Lester Pearson. The fourth and final presentation in this episode is by Tim Rowse, and it's on Menzies' disenchantment with the British Commonwealth.
We'll start in 1958. Cold War tensions were high. The space race was in its early days, with the Soviets considered to be well ahead of the free world. The Russian embassy in Canberra remained shut due to the Petrov affair, and the spectre of nuclear apocalypse would soon be brought to Melbourne by the filming of On the Beach, an adaptation of Neville Shute's novel about the aftermath of World War III. As he reckoned with these unsettling signs of the times, Prime Minister Robert Menzies' mind was never too far from his favourite game. At the height of the Suez Canal crisis in 1956, or so the story goes, his press secretary, Hugh Dash, had told a gaggle of London newspaper reporters that on account of current events, Menzies had no time whatsoever even to think about cricket. With comic timing, Menzies then poked his head around the door and asked, "Have any more wickets fallen, Hughie?" So it was opposite when Menzies received a letter from Graham Wallace Smith of Wagga Wagga with an idea that sounds like a script for an Australian film along the lines of The Dish. A team of Australian old collegians, including the former Test cricketer Leo O'Brien, wished to include Soviet Russia in its upcoming tour of Europe. The idea, Wallace Smith made clear, was far broader than simply travelling for a photo opportunity in front of St Basil's. "I expect," he wrote, "you are beginning to think, as I have, of all the undesirable reasons in having Russia playing cricket. And I know you will weigh them with the advantages that could be achieved, better understanding and more friendly relations in having more things in common. The personnel in the team would be of the variety who could only do credit to their country and would carry out any responsibilities entrusted to them with considerable decorum. The unofficial suggestion that the Queen may travel to Russia at some time makes me feel we would not be branded as heretics." It was indeed true that a young Queen Elizabeth had been mooted as travelling to Russia about that time. But the prospect of using cricket as a kind of prototype for the ping-pong diplomacy later undertaken by the United States and China is a tantalising one indeed. Menzies certainly gave the matter some thought, replying in April that he could see much that was good in the venture. And while it did not come to pass in 1959, the notion of a cricket goodwill tour to Russia floated around the game for quite some time. By 1962, in fact, it won support from no less a pair of cricketing authorities than Sir Donald Bradman and Richie Benaud, around talks for the old Collegians team to play a game against the 1964 Australian Ashes touring party to England following the conclusion of that series. Benaud, in fact, was quoted as saying that Canberra's diplomatic blessing provides some idea of the importance placed on the plan. If we can think for a moment of Richie Benaud as a potential diplomatic envoy to Soviet Russia. Why would Menzies, Bradman and Benaud have entertained such an idea at all? And why cricket in particular? The previous address has given us a pretty good idea, but there's a very good and quick way of generating an understanding of how these guys viewed cricket. There were a famous few words by Lord Harris, the former English Test cricketer and sometime Governor of Bombay from 1931. Bradman loved these words so much he kept a picture of them, and he read them to the world when he was interviewed by Ray Martin in 1996. "You do well to love cricket, for it is more free from anything sordid, anything dishonourable than any game in the world. To play it keenly, honourably, generously, self-sacrificingly, is a moral lesson in itself, and the classroom is God's air and sunshine. Foster it, my brothers, so that it may attract all who can find time to play it. Protect it from anything that would sully it, so that it may grow in favour with all men." In other words, a cricketer was more than just a sportsman. He was an exemplar of the ideals that Menzies and Bradman held dear in their view of how Australia and the world should operate. Menzies clearly felt that cricket and cricketers could provide a strong voice for his idea of fair play in international circles. So much so that in 1956 he asked Bradman about the possibility of becoming the next Australian High Commissioner in London. We know this because of how a British newspaper report was effectively confirmed by Bradman in a flustered-sounding letter to Menzies soon afterwards. "My dear Mr. Menzies," he wrote, "I have just been rung by the Truth Newspapers Limited and told that a story was appearing in the London newspapers that there was a possibility of my replacing Sir Thomas White as High Commissioner for Australia. Needless to say, I informed the caller that I knew nothing whatever about it. However, in view of a conversation which ensued between us recently, I feel it is my duty to let you know of this call and assure you, though I feel certain you would not need such an assurance, that the text of our conversation has not passed beyond my lips. P.S. Since writing the above, I have received a ring from the local editor of the News, Adelaide newspaper, on the same subject. He said he proposed contacting Canberra to obtain a denial, and therefore I thought it wise to send you a telegram as follows. I am disturbed by the story appearing in today's papers and have issued denial any knowledge thereof." As a journalist, this was a really nice example of how sometimes something that's true can be obfuscated just a little. Menzies' confidence in Bradman's capacity to play a vital role for the Commonwealth at Australia House was drawn in part from a key facet of their relationship. One of the recurring events of his time in politics, both before and during his second stint as Prime Minister, was how he was sought for advice by Australia's cricket captains. They didn't ask Menzies about setting fields or making runs, though he would doubtless have obliged in some detail had they done so. Instead, Bradman and Benno were among those who wanted Menzies' counsel when it came to cricket diplomacy. In 1948, ahead of what would become known as the Invincibles Tour of England, Bradman was duly advised about speech topics. After discussing a trend towards news reporters making mischief with players on the touring team, a trend that would only intensify, Menzies counselled Bradman to speak strongly of how Britain needed the Dominions in order to retain a seat at the world's top table. "The general plan," he wrote, "must be one in which Great Britain and the Dominions are seen as partners participating in the work. It's no doubt quite true, unhappily, that Great Britain by herself is no longer a first-rate power. But the British Empire, including Great Britain, can be a first-rate power, but only if it learns to think and act cohesively. It is for this reason that people like myself have been hammering away asking for a British Empire conference. People who know that they are really partners in a great enterprise are not likely to deal with each other just as if they were seller and customer dealing at arm's length." Bradman would enhance his reputation as an eloquent speaker on the tour, although he was criticised unfairly in some quarters when a selectively cropped photograph appeared to show him disrespecting King George by having his hands in his pockets as they walked around the grounds of Balmoral. As Bradman would later explain, the gathering was casual and many others were adopting a similar posture. They had simply been cropped out of the shot. The cricket itself was one-sided, as a well-drilled and well-fed Australian side cruised to a 4-0 Ashes victory over 5 tests and were unbeaten around the United Kingdom, the only Australian touring team ever to get through a full tour without tasting defeat. The merit of this achievement has been questioned in recent years. Bradman was certainly ruthless in his use of fast bowlers Ray Lindwall and Keith Miller, which some interpreted as a get-square for his subjection to bodyline 15 years before. And many of England's cricketers, in a country still on rationing, had experienced a tougher wartime than some of the tourists. Rationing of a different kind sprang to mind a decade later when Australia were making preparations for a challenging but also politically significant tour of India and Pakistan. The team was led by Benno, who had marshalled his men to an unexpected triumph over a heavily fancied England side in the summer of 1958-59. Menzies was transfixed by this turn of events and was moved to send a heartfelt telegram to the opening batsman and friend of his through the Melbourne Cricket Club, Colin MacDonald, following a century in Melbourne. It simply read, "I'm proud of you." Years later, MacDonald reflected that a place in the national cricket team was its own form of social mobility. Cricket, he said, gave you access to a world that was otherwise only available to the wealthy and the powerful. Power needed to be exercised on a few fronts before the tour to Pakistan and India. First of all came the vital matter of rations, a sufficient allocation of beer for the touring team. At that time, it was still considered one of the safest drinks in that part of the world, and numerous fast bowlers still swore by it as a means of recovery. Sam Loxton toured with Bradman in 1948 and was by now a Liberal MP, having won the state seat of Paran in early 1955. Here was one example of sport and politics mixing thoroughly. The Australian Cricket Board appointed Loxton as manager for the tour, and he swiftly went into action using his political links to help with the question of beer. On February 24, 1959, he wrote to Menzies. "Dear boss," he began, "you might remember that one of my worries regarding the Indian tour was the question of beer. I had a chat with Richie Benno during the test and believe that a quantity of 400 dozen canned beers, although it may appear an enormous consumption, is reasonable on the basis of approximately 3 cans per day per player for a party of 18 during the 90 days of the tour. 2 days later, this tells you how important it was, Menzies' private secretary sent a communique to the Minister of Trade, Blackjack McEwen, emphasising the importance of the task. The Prime Minister, he wrote, would appreciate if you are able to make such arrangements as are necessary for the provisioning of the Australian team in this very important respect. A couple of weeks later, it was Benno's turn to correspond with Menzies, seeking advice about the sensitive nature of the tour in terms of international relations. I have one small request to make following the announcement that I've been chosen to lead the team. I have no doubt that in addition to the cricket on this tour, there will be a certain amount of diplomatic importance attached to the 14 weeks we are abroad. I know you are an extremely busy man. However, if possible, I would appreciate a few lines of briefing on particular aspects of relations between India, Pakistan and our own country. No doubt Sam Loxton will have his finger on most of the diplomatic angles, but some help with any of the pitfalls likely to be encountered would be very much appreciated. This specific request and Benno's overall sentiment were both well placed, for the tour turned out to feature the only occasion on which a sitting American president has watched a day of Test cricket. It was Dwight Eisenhower's good fortune that his state visit to Pakistan coincided with the 4th day of the 3rd Test between Pakistan and Australia in Karachi on December 8, 1959. It was Eisenhower's bad fortune that this also happened to be among the most soporific days of Test cricket ever seen. Pakistan crawled to 5 for 104 in their second innings, having started the day none for none, with Hanif Mohammed spending the entire day eking out an unbeaten tally of 40. This slow play, in wild contrast to the breathless affair we've just witnessed in the current Ashes series, came about in part because of the pitch. Pakistan at that time were still holding Test matches on matting, stretched out over clay, causing the ball to come off the surface without much in the way of pace or venom in the stroke play. Still, Eisenhower was a good sport. He applauded anything remotely resembling a good scoring shot and also cheered any instance of good fielding by the Australians. By doing so, Eisenhower played his part in a wider program to ensure close military and diplomatic ties between the United States and Pakistan. American officialdom had been reciprocated by bankrolling a stateside stopover for Pakistan's cricketers on their way to the West Indies. Cricket, it seemed, had never been more pivotal to the prosecution of the Cold War. There would be one more issue by which Menzies cricket and evolving Cold War attitudes would be defined. It concerned apartheid South Africa, which was effectively expelled from the Commonwealth in 1961. Menzies was vocal in his opposition to the move, arguing that domestic policies of member governments were not to be interfered with. As he said in 1960, the Prime Minister's conference would break up in disorder and the new Commonwealth would disintegrate if we affected to discuss and decide what we thought to be the proper measure of democracy in our various countries, whether particular groups should or should not have the vote, whether oppositions should be respected, whether a parliament should control the executive. On all matters, autonomous or independent nations must have the right to manage their own affairs in their own way. We are not a court. We are brothers in a special international fraternity. Menzies was not alone in thinking, at the time and later, that South Africa was a southern bulwark against what he saw as the creeping threat of communism on the African continent. Where cricket was concerned, he did all he could to maintain the brotherhood with South Africa, as did the Australian Cricket Board. Despite also being excluded from the International Cricket Conference in 1961, South Africa continued to be invited to play Australia. Its players toured here in 1963-64, and Australian teams toured South Africa in 66-67 and 69-70. During the former tour, Menzies hosted the South Africans for the Prime Minister's 11s match, and during their visit told the touring captain Trevor Goddard that he secretly hoped for a Test series victory by the Springboks over Australia to clear away all this nonsense about your Test matches being regarded as unofficial. The series ended in a tie, by the way. But Menzies' most intriguing involvement during the period concerned Graham Thomas, a young batsman of promise who purportedly, because of some Native American blood in his family history, was of quite dark complexion. Bradman, who served as chairman of the ACB from 1960 to 63 and again from 69 to 72, was worried about whether South African officials would approve Thomas' inclusion in the squad for the tour in 66-67 and conveyed that to Thomas. As a proud young cricketer, Thomas replied in their meeting at Melbourne's Windsor Hotel that he would be very upset to be left out of the trip on any kind of racial basis, and Bradman backed down. Menzies was aware of the situation and took it upon himself to do some checking with South Africa. He related the episode to his good friend Jack Fingleton in 1969, ahead of what would prove to be Australia's final Test series against South Africa for 24 years. So far as the case of young Thomas is concerned, he wrote, I should tell you that the course of events was as follows. I was told, I think by Alan Barnes, who was the secretary of the ACB at the time, that before Thomas was chosen to go to South Africa, he and some members of the board were a little anxious lest the government of South Africa might raise objections, possibly after the team arrived. I said the way to deal with that was to find out in advance. I therefore spoke to the South African ambassador in Canberra. I remember showing him a few photographs of young Thomas and saying to him, in a slightly facetious way, that though he was somewhat dark complexioned, he was no darker than thousands of fully Caucasian types to be seen on the beaches of Sydney. The ambassador told me that he thought that there would be no difficulty whatever, the objection on the part of his people being to people who presented what he called a Negro appearance. He told me that he was quite sure that his views about Thomas would represent those of the South African government, but that if he turned out to be wrong, he would advise me. Even so, Menzies could feel the winds of change around him and the ACB so far as South Africa was concerned. Separately, he lamented to Fingleton that international cricket was becoming politicised. Views on apartheid South Africa continued to be largely split down conservative and progressive party lines in Australia for years after Menzies' prime ministership concluded in early 1966. What will happen to international cricket, Menzies wondered. If the reigning champions are excluded from international competition, I am at a gloomy loss to understand. Why should the greatest game in the world find itself bedevilled by the prattlings of mean men and by their failure to realise that the game comes first and that its promotion is not the prerogative of conservatives or socialists or any other political organisation, but is best means yet devised for increasing international understanding and mutual pleasure? Beyond Menzies, the government of Billy McMahon wrestled with the matter of sporting links with South Africa, with the 71-72 cricket tour abandoned following the ugliness that accompanied a Springbok rugby tour in 1971. There were some, a young John Howard among them, who continued to lament South Africa's absence from international sporting competition during this time. In March 1975, he spoke on the matter in the House of Representatives. If we are ever going to achieve a situation in which the horrible racial discrimination which does occur in South Africa, and which is probably a level of racial discrimination which is duplicated in many countries throughout the world, is ever going to be broken down, we are not going to break it down by hermetically sealing off South Africa from the rest of the world. We are not going to break it down by having no contact with the South Africans. And we are certainly not going to break it down by preventing cricket contests between South Africa and Australia. This may have been coincidental, but at the time, the Australian Cricket Board still harboured some hope of bringing a South African team to Australia in 1975-76. As it was, the West Indies stepped into the breach for a 6-test tour. Over the next 20 years, they would become the world's preeminent cricket team, while South Africa's players were only occasionally seen in Australia as part of invitational sides and, for 2 summers, as part of Kerry Packer's World Series cricket breakaway. By then, views were evolving on both sides of the House. Following the dismissal in November 1975, Malcolm Fraser continued the Whitlam government's opposition to apartheid. South Africa was no longer being viewed by Australians as a battleground in the fight against communism, although that view did persist through the 1980s during war with Angola, but rather as a place where human rights were disregarded. In that way, it became possible to abhor communism and apartheid at the same time. Alexander Downer put it well when discussing Fraser in 2022. Some have said that Fraser's crusade against apartheid did not sit comfortably or logically with his fierce opposition to the Soviet Union. After all, many of Southern Africa's freedom fighters aligned themselves with communism and socialism. That is wrong. In both cases, the apartheid regime of South Africa and the oppressive dictatorship of the Soviet Union disregarded the rights and dignity of individuals. No one with Fraser's disposition could ever tolerate either regime, and he did not. Cricket, though, would remain a key forum for politicians to exchange diplomatic views, for the ideals of the Commonwealth to be played out, and for the differences of politics to be swept aside by a shared love of Australia's oldest sporting contest, the Ashes. No better example of this can be found than by how, after Bob Hawke's death in 2019, John Howard spoke of his former rival in warm terms. I want to acknowledge very warmly and quite unreservedly my respect for his respect, love and passion for the game. I think I can say on behalf of everyone in this room that Bob Hawke understood the centrality of sport, and within that, the centrality of cricket to the Australian identity, and that is a very important thing. As for Pakistan, Howard has often told the story of 2005, when Australia's loss of the Ashes to England in an epic series. He chatted with then President Pervez Musharraf. At a United Nations meeting in New York soon after England's captain Andrew Strauss had taken the urn, Howard was offering his congratulations to the British Prime Minister Tony Blair when Musharraf walked over. "I never forget it," John Howard has said. He said, "Don't worry, John, we will avenge you." True to his word, England went to Pakistan a couple of months later that year and lost. He really did it. Cricket then is seldom far from a Prime Minister's mind, and for more reasons than one. As Menzies once remarked while watching a test match at the MCG, one eminent personage asked him what was the greatest problem confronting the nation. When Menzies retorted that it was the problem of getting another wicket before lunch, he was quite offended and no doubt resolved to vote against such a light-minded fellow at the next election. Thank you, everyone.
The nature of Australia-India relationship has come a long way with sort of Albanese and Modi having a bromance in the cricket field, as they did 2 years ago in India. But look, 75 years ago, this relationship was quite fraught. It was a complicated relationship, and fundamentally, it was rooted in a lot of sort of personal animosity between Menzies and Nehru, really. There's been a lot of sort of scholarly debate about what really drove this sort of, mutual distaste. Was it sort of just essential idealism versus realism? So, Menzies had a very realpolitik view of security, of balance of power. If you're not with us, you're against us. And Nehru obviously was sort of, nationalist India, a newly independent, post-colonial, almost, want to disassociate from the British sort of identity. And obviously, sort of Menzies was driven by that sort of British to the bootstraps kind of narrative. So was it simply sort of this, idealism versus sort of nationalism? My arguments have always been towards more, as a security scholar, has been about sort of structural changes to the international order that were brought in at a time, at the shadow of the Cold War, and the spectre really fell on Australia and India because Menzies, as we know, is very much aligned to the US and obviously the UK part of the world order, whereas sort of India was hardcore non-aligned, right? So when I say hardcore non-aligned, what does that mean? To Menzies, it was very unclear because he fundamentally thought that being non-aligned meant you're not with us. And there was really sort of this understanding of, if you're not with us, you're against us. And to Nehru's sort of idea of non-alignment, which was fundamentally different to what his daughter then did when she took office, much after sort of the Menzies period, was really about India carving its own identity. Right? For sort of 150, 200 years, India was under the shadow of this British Raj. And that really, took away a lot of it from its sort of not only economic sort of might, but also its heritage, its self-identity. And that really was what Nehru, and obviously now Modi, is trying to undo. But fundamentally, they had very different readings of the world order and very different readings of what it is to be in the Commonwealth and what it is to be in the Cold War. But what I've always really found very interesting when studying both these men is that they had a lot more in common than they thought or probably knew. They were both sort of lawyers by education, very sort of pragmatic, both sort of, longest serving prime ministers, although I think Modi is about to beat Nehru's record in a couple of months. So I think we'll take that away from Nehru. But they had a lot in common. They were voracious readers. They had a lot of interest in sort of foreign policy. And, Nehru was ultimately a British sort of education. He went to Oxford. So he was also very British in his ways and his thinking, his accent as well. So it was a very, like I said, a complicated relationship in how they both were so similar and yet obviously had very sort of open disagreements with each other, causing a lot of sort of kerfuffle and embarrassment to their bureaucrats, especially at sort of multilateral forums like the UN and later sort of the Commonwealth heads of government, CHOGM. So a lot of literature on Menzies really talks about, and rightly so, about his sort of interests and his sort of, inclination towards being a part of the Commonwealth, being sort of, looking to that sort of part of the world. But in my research, I found that actually he had a deep interest in Asia. And that was, shown by the amount of times he visited New Delhi, the amount of times he visited Islamabad even. So he was actually one of the leaders that Prime Minister Nehru met the most, and obviously Liaquat Ali Khan as well. A lot of the fundamental sort of misunderstandings between Nehru and Menzies were driven from the fact that Menzies would always make it a point to stop over in Islamabad if you were going to Delhi. And that's a big no-no if you're ever going to Delhi. So fundamentally, there was this sort of, Menzies understood the strategic imperative of having sort of, a safer Asia, because that meant a safer Australia. And that's one of the sort of strategic imaginations that I believe has still carried on through. And with sort of, Kashmir being a part of my talk, but really Kashmir isn't really what I wanted to focus on, but it's emblematic. It's a metaphor really for how Menzies understood the importance of what we now call sort of a free and open Indo-Pacific, right? So he believed a potential sort of, for any potential for world peace and therefore security of Australia, there had to be sort of, closer Commonwealth relations, closer sort of cooperation, and, a fundamentally peaceful neighborhood, of which Kashmir and India were an intrinsic part of. But of course, there's, when you look at sort of security studies and strategic studies, there is that fundamental understanding that the reason why Kashmir took such a central place in his understanding was the fact that there is, the United States and the UK were also very, very invested in the vexed issue of Kashmir and Indian security more broadly. And that kind of underpinned why Menzies was then sort of so interested, because it made sense for it to be a part of that larger sort of cause. But there was also, not tiny, but statistically significant aspect of the fact that Australia did want sort of closer Commonwealth cooperation and sort of stronger ties within the South Asian part of the Commonwealth, only because they wanted to sell some arms to the region, really. A lot of Australian sort of secondhand arms sales were made to South Asia. And if the situation was unstable, which it was due to Kashmir quite a bit, these sales would be really difficult to make, which ultimately the sales couldn't happen, partly because it was just a very sort of tumultuous time. But a lot of it really was, the fact that India's role at the UN, especially around Kashmir, was really sort of at odds with what Australia really wanted to achieve at the UN regards to Kashmir. And to Australia's credit, they did do a lot of sort of mediation attempts. A lot of it was done sort of by Owen Dixon, who was an Australian, and really sort of, between 49 and 51, there were 11 proposals for demilitarization of Kashmir, which had been accepted by Pakistan. But due to the fact that there were some fundamental no-nos on India's part, which, look, rightly or wrongly, given the difficult sort of torrid past of Kashmir, they were fundamentally sort of not agreed upon by New Delhi. But really sort of, Australia's neutrality on Kashmir was seen as this kind of double standard, right? So on one hand, Nehru said that we are non-aligned, and Menzies disagreed with that. And then when sort of, Australia came to the table and said, no, we're neutral on Kashmir, India disagreed with that. So there was this sort of, fundamental kind of disagreements on each other's neutrality on specific sort of issues, right? And really that kind of points towards my broader thesis about how strategic sort of understandings of the region were vastly different between sort of New Delhi and Canberra at the time. And look, what happened at the UN with sort of, the different proposals being sort of rejected by India, it did test Australia and India ties, and it did test sort of Menzies' patience as well, because he was really invested in this initiative. India was often sort of a bit rude in the way that they sort of rejected Australia's mediation attempts, especially because Australia's interests were then sort of questioned by India's foreign secretary, who was a very important man in V.K. Menon, in Nehru's sort of trusted inner circle of diplomats. And there was a lot of sort of unfriendliness that was seen from the Indian diplomats towards sort of Australia at the UN. But fundamentally, it was rooted in this anti-imperialist sort of, because you also have to understand this was a time of the White Australia policy, which was not seen too kindly by New Delhi. So it was kind of this, fundamentally opposed views of the world. And really, this then led the Australian bureaucracy to really do a lot of thinking. And this is where sort of Menzies' role as an administrator really comes out, which I don't think enough literature talks about, because oftentimes Menzies is seen as this, he wrote the foreign policy and he did the prime ministerialship and he did everything. Well, actually, he gave his bureaucrats a lot of room, a lot of sort of agency to think about the world, to think about India specifically, because remember, Australia got a lot of diplomats from the British Raj, right? So including Casey, who was the former governor of Bengal. When India became independent, Australia was one of the most India-literate countries in the world, only because it had a lot of these ex-Indian sort of government servants now in very, very sort of important diplomatic positions. So Australia was really looked to, and the Menzies administration particularly was looked to as, when advice was needed on India, because they had obviously not just knowledge, but connections, right? So Casey, for example, was sort of, on first name basis with Gandhi and Congress leaders because, he had seen the freedom struggle and he participated in it, obviously not for the freedom, but really sort of, being the governor of Bengal, which you all know is a very, very politically important state in the east of India. So, look, there was a lot of sort of fundamental knowledge about India that Menzies knew his bureaucrats had, and he gave them a lot of sort of operating power to work around creating a solution for India. One of the things we never actually talk about is Menzies actually made sure that India was the largest recipient of Australian aid in the first half of the Cold War. And that surprises many, right? Because of the relationship between Menzies and Nehru. But that tells you about the strategic importance of India to Australia and obviously sort of the Menzies administration. And, obviously aid is not just money, right? It's fungible goodwill that a country gives to another sort of country. We can debate about why countries give aid, but a lot of it, especially during the Cold War, was to get strategic benefits, right? And Menzies obviously saw India important enough to give this much aid, even though he knew that, the USSR and the US were also sort of, love bombing India with a lot of aid, and Australian aid would eventually almost be lost because of its small amount. But the fact that Australian bureaucrats worked with each state, and there were many states, on understanding the needs of India. So there was a lot of sort of hard work put in by Menzies and his sort of foreign ministers, Hasluck and what have you. They worked really hard on India, and Menzies made sure that they were always well-resourced to do so. So fundamentally, it really does raise these questions about, was the animosity just a personal thing and the actual sort of strategic imperatives of the relationship far outweighing just these two men who couldn't get along at the UN? But look, Menzies was relentless with trying to get sort of a resolution for sort of, trying to mediate the Kashmir issue. And he really used the Commonwealth then as a fora to really figure out if the dispute could be resolved. A lot of sort of his impetus in the Chogam of 1951 was that, we have to now work out within the Commonwealth, how can we fix up a framework that would really sort of, help Kashmir be solved, well and truly. Obviously, we know that didn't work, but it was his sort of relentless kind of inexorable push to find a mutually acceptable kind of Commonwealth solution to find a settlement, which is such an interesting part of history that we often overlook. But look, he visited India, he visited Pakistan personally to acquaint himself with the issue and really sort of, with, India and Pakistan being as they were, to really understand what could be a possible workable solution. And he, to his credit, he did establish a framework. He was supported by Attlee in terms of finding out a limited plebiscite way to sort of, make sure that India doesn't consider this an illegitimate plebiscite, and really, figuring out maybe even a Commonwealth brigade that could sort of assume responsibility for security during this plebiscite. And look, there were disagreements from both sides, from Pakistan, India. I think current records state that Pakistan was partially agreeable to this, but it really kind of lost in the sands of time. But inevitably, the Commonwealth mediation really just failed to bring about any resolution. But it is sort of, seen as a time in history that here was an Australian Prime Minister really trying hard for South Asian security right after sort of, the beginning of the decolonization movement, which, obviously he was really against. But there was this sort of, push for a safer Asia and a safer sort of what we now call Indo-Pacific. But he had a wider imagination for Australia's strategic neighborhood, and that is something that, I think still carries a lot of weight, especially for those of us like me who work on sort of Indo-Pacific security. A lot of sort of the brickwork was laid by the Menzies administration in terms of what the engagement strategy between Canberra and its sort of, like-minded, trusted partners in the region with New Delhi, like New Delhi, could be. So this has been called the Menzies Initiative, which I must admit I coined because no one's written about this. And the fact that it's really sort of, it shows that, despite sort of using Commonwealth mechanisms, the fact that the issue was such a vexed one, given the fact that there were so many sort of local border clashes that were breaking out at the time, there was a lot of sort of aid and assistance that was given both, not just to Delhi, but also to Islamabad by Menzies. So it was, while both Islamabad and New Delhi were non-committal, there was a lot of sort of cables and communications that were happening between both sort of the Delhi post, Islamabad post, and the headquarters in Canberra, which really sort of, was one of the first setups of a strong South Asia strategy for, now we call them DFAT, they were called Department of External Affairs at that time. And so, this Menzies Initiative, which was really sort of, showcased how complicated Menzies' thinking was about what makes Australia a safer country. And hopefully one day when my thesis becomes a book, I can write a whole story. But till then, you can read this chapter in the book Zach's writing. So thank you, everyone.
I was beginning to get a bit worried over the last day and a half that there's been too much emphasis on Menzies as the indomitable Englishman. And I'm used to speaking of him as a Scot and his Scottish heritage and as Mingus. And in that context, I'd just like to draw to your attention that we are getting close to St. Andrew's Day, and he perhaps wouldn't be with us today. There's a long St. Andrew's Day lunch being held at the Kelvin Club, which I was invited to, and I'm here. I'm sure that he would have enjoyed being there, drinking the whiskey and eating the haggis. And tomorrow night with David Kemp at the Melbourne Scots and their celebration of St. Andrew's Day. So I just bring that to your attention. I'm sure that Angus, if he's around somewhere, would agree with me. But a little bit more of that later. As we do come to the subject, I would like to acknowledge, in an old Pearson kind of way, the ancient people of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, but also, and this is important, I think, in the context of this conference, the coming with British settlement of rule of law and parliamentary democracy. And then also, as I've looked around this room, the influence of multiculturalism here in Australia. And in a sense, that's been the Commonwealth's contribution. I mean, Zach, in a sense, was jokingly introducing me as the epitome of that. But I was a Scot that studied in Edinburgh, then in a Commonwealth scholarship in Canada, and then ended up teaching here in Australia. And so moved around that Commonwealth that Menzies himself knew. And it struck me over the last couple of days, there were a number of things that I was going to say that I don't need to say because they've already been said in other papers. So that's actually a help in just trying to pull some of these things together. And one of the things that struck me from yesterday, and really is an important part of the story of what I'm going to talk about, are the various trips that Menzies engaged upon. And he didn't start until he was quite old, as we heard about yesterday, until he was about 41. But then he travelled over 18 years to about 20 countries and multiple trips to the one that I'm going to speak about, to Canada. We heard yesterday about how he developed relationships with Winston Churchill over martinis, and I'm sure various other drinks, probably even some Scottish whiskey, with Keynes, and in my case, with Mackenzie King, the first Prime Minister that he met. He did, in fact, engage with 4 different Canadian Prime Ministers. The first one, like we heard about Nehru, William Lyon Mackenzie King, who you might guess from his name has a Scottish background as well, so there was that Scottish connection between the two of them. But Mackenzie King is the longest-serving Canadian Prime Minister. There seems to be a theme here, as well as Nehru that we heard about, just about to lose that advantage, and Menzies himself. Mackenzie King, towards the end of his time, and in the first visit that Menzies had to Canada, it was really just at the beginning of his time, but towards the end of his first short term. So he worked with 4 different Canadian Prime Ministers, from William Lyon Mackenzie King to Lester Pearson. I don't think any of them played cricket. Canada's slightly different, and we'll speak about that in terms of relating probably more to the US. And Lester Pearson, images have been used of him as a baseball player rather than a cricketer, that he was a hitter rather than a pitcher. But all of them played a significant role in shaping Canada's and Australia's relationship with the Commonwealth. For Mackenzie King, served multiple terms between 1921 and 1948 and navigated Canada's evolving independence within the British Empire. Louis Saint Laurent, French-Canadian, was Prime Minister from 48 to 57, and that French connection is also important in terms of shaping the way that the Commonwealth was regarded and the position that Canada took. But Saint Laurent continued Canada's engagement with the Commonwealth and strengthened, we could argue, diplomatic ties with Australia. Then John Diefenbaker, who I think we're going to have a paper on that this afternoon, so I won't say too much about Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker was the one that was on the same side of politics as Menzies, and the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit Australia, strengthening diplomatic and trade relations between the two countries. He was also a strong supporter of Commonwealth and Commonwealth unity, but particularly emphasised human rights and anti-apartheid policies. And then Lester Pearson, who before he became Prime Minister had served as Minister for External Affairs, had been a senior diplomat, had been an academic, had won the Nobel Peace Prize. There's one for Donald Trump. But he modernised Canada's foreign policy and strengthened its role, particularly in international peacekeeping. So there are various things that I touch on in the paper that I won't spend a lot of time on here, looking at the approach of Canada and Australia to the Statute of Westminster of 1931. We've heard about that already. World War II diplomacy, post-war Commonwealth relations, trade and economic policies, and Cold War peacekeeping. We've heard about all these things in different ways. And as I say, I do touch upon them in the paper, but I want to talk about a few other things. Canada and Australia. This was Partners Long Estranged. It was a book that was edited by Margaret Macmillan, who some of you might know, who was at the University of Toronto as the Provost of Trinity College, then at St Anthony's College as the head, and in Oxford. And this was a book that came out a few years ago looking at this relationship. Mackenzie King said that in looking at Canada, and I think this applies to Australia perhaps as well, and we'll come back to this, that there's too much geography and not enough history. And I think we've been talking about this at the conference. in a sense. And the Robert Menzies Institute has been very devoted, as we heard yesterday with the young people, to get back to looking at history and getting young people to study the history. But I think, they're similar in terms of the size of the countries. The differences in terms of geography is that Canada has the US to the south. And we have, as our good friend Geoffrey Blaney would say, the tyranny of distance. And I think that has impacted in the way that both countries actually then viewed their relationship with empire and relationship with Commonwealth. Let me say a little bit about the early history, just a few facts to provide a framework. The first connection between Canada and Australia, it could be argued, was after the 1837 uprisings in Upper and Lower Canada, in what is now Ontario and Quebec. The convicts, the rebels, were sent to Van Diemen's Land. And there's been quite a bit written on this. It could have included Mackenzie King's grandfather, William Lyon Mackenzie, the Dundee-born Upper Canada politician and paper owner who was part of that uprising, one of the leaders, but fled to the US, eventually coming back to Ontario. We could have been standing here today speaking about Mackenzie King's contribution to Australia rather than Menzies, perhaps, if his grandfather had been sent to Van Diemen's Land. Interesting speculation. In 1867, of course, we have Canadian Confederation, with the exception of Newfoundland. That doesn't come into after the Second World War. In 1894, the Canadians call a colonial conference in Ottawa, and to that we have the 6 Australian colonies, we have New Zealand, we have South Africa, and we have Britain attending. And the main items of business, this again sounds very contemporary, were about trade and tariffs. And one of the outcomes of this was that Canada sent a trade commissioner to Australia, John Short Lark. Unfortunately, what started to happen was that, again, it was because of geography, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, started to look more to the US for trade. They initially thought that they'd build this relationship with Australia. There had been a steamline company set up. There was a cable being laid. But they started to look more towards the US, which they thought made more sense. If we jump forward to William Lyon Mackenzie King, who's elected for the first time December 1921, he was constantly aware of the French factor within Canada, of Quebec. How do we keep them happy? And so at the Imperial Conference of 1923, he started to push for an independent foreign policy. He didn't, we heard yesterday of Menzies' characteristics, and I think someone talked about the feminine, masculine, and they didn't really hold to that, this Freudian analysis. But William Lyon Mackenzie King was an interesting case to study. He saw himself as small and fat, ugly, and self-effacing. And he said as he went to the conference, "I'm filled with terror at the thought of having to speak many times, at my ability to work out themes." He wasn't very self-confident in that kind of public role. He saw himself as a poor public speaker, but he was persistent. And King pursued an independent policy as the Brits, as Lord Curzon, pushed for an imperial foreign policy. He did take some opposition from the Australian Prime Minister at the time, from Stanley Bruce, and he was accused of trying to damage the empire And Canadian-Australian relations didn't get off to a great start at that conference. Trade was something that was also seen to be particularly divisive. Mackenzie King was re-elected in 1935 at a time when there was better trade with the US and there was a decline with Australia. And Canada stood with Australia at the declaration of war on the eve of the Second World War. And into this picture then enters one Robert Mingus. In September 1939, Canada joined Australia at Britain's side, and Australia sent Sir William Glasgow, former General Queenslander, to Ottawa to be the High Commissioner. And his role was to help develop, in particular, training of air crews in Canada, Australian air crews. And he set up Anzac clubs in Ottawa and Halifax. And personal relationships were strengthened. And this is something that I think is particularly important. Diplomacy is actually about person to person. And I think Georgina, in an article written some time ago, actually spoke about that in terms of Menzies and all of his trips and his visits and, say, meeting with Churchill, and that was the start of it. And he got this travel bug, and throughout his career, he did this. And in 1941, there was his first visit to Canada and with Mackenzie King, and with the opportunity to speak to the Canadian Parliament. And he really, it was said, lifted the Canadian spirits. And I just want to give you a sense of this and then how Mackenzie King actually viewed him. Mr. Menzies was brought into the House of Commons by Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and received a chair in the right of the Speaker. Addressing the House, he said, "It is not for me to tell the honourable members of this House what their duty is. There has never been a parliament in a free British country which did not do its duty. All I want to say is to repeat to you what I say to myself, that nothing matters except that we should so act now that when this war is over, we shall live in a free world, in the kind of world in which we want to live. What does it matter if we come out into that world bankrupt? What does it matter if we come out into that world with lower standards of material living than we have now? What does it matter if in that world the rich are not so rich and we must all share an honourable poverty? These things do not matter. The only thing that matters to free men is that the policies under which they live shall be the policies that they themselves devised as the representatives of their own people." Mackenzie King was greatly impressed by the meeting with Menzies, and he wrote in his diary that Menzies took the city more or less by storm. Now remember what he'd said about himself, and he said, "Menzies is a fine-looking fellow, splendid presence, great vigour, and has a wonderful gift for speaking. He has endless confidence in himself and doesn't mind putting himself very much in the limelight. He reveals his Scotch Presbyterian origin in his thoughts and views generally, has many of the qualities of a great leader, but I feel while his sympathies are broad, he nevertheless is thinking pretty much of Menzies most of the time, and likes very much the environments of high society, palaces, etc." He actually also said that he thought he was egotistical, overbearing, and self-centred, but that was elsewhere. He thought all of this would cost him, as indeed it did, because when he returned to Australia, he ended up losing the election. And Dame Patty had actually warned him, or Patty, as she was at the time, warned him of that. But he received a terrific reception, and on future visits to Canada, like 1955 and other times, he was there 8 times, there were similar receptions. It's said in 55, when he visited Vancouver, that he received as great a reception as the King did when he visited. And he got various honorary degrees from Canadian universities, from the University of British Columbia, from McGill, and other places. So he was well regarded. But the world moved on, and we've heard about the issues of the Cold War, particularly in Asia, that the other ministers had to deal with. And these are, that's Diefenbaker. The previous one was St. Laurent, and then we have Lester Pearson. I mean, St. Laurent gets a bit of a rough deal, actually, in Canadian historiography. But he did work hard to build relationships, but again was very aware of the French connection. I might just say a little bit about the relationship with Lester Pearson and then conclude. I think we'll hear about Diefenbaker this afternoon. Lester Pearson came from an interesting background, and again, we've heard this theme, I think, throughout yesterday about the role of the church and spiritual background in the life of some of the people that we've been talking about. Particularly, we know this with Robert Menzies and his Methodist background going to Wesley, his father's background being Presbyterian but being lay minister with the Methodists. Lester Pearson came from a similar background. His father was a Wesleyan Methodist minister, and he was the Prime Minister from 63 to 68, but had a long career in public service prior to that and had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957. In his address to the Empire Club in 1958, he commented on the Commonwealth, and he said, "The Commonwealth appears to be no more than an alumni association whose independent, spirited, self-willed members, presided over by their former headmaster, recognise no other obligations towards one another than may be prompted by the heart or by considerations of self-interest." He went on that there were some truths in this, but he still saw a future for the Commonwealth. And in 1954, he had said at an American college graduation that he spoke at, "We are touchy at being considered in this country as a species of British colonial, because among other things we cherish a monarchy that links us with our past and symbolises our association with other free nations in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and in Australia, in a world commonwealth." Each of the Canadian Prime Ministers that are in my paper did support the idea of the Commonwealth, but they were prepared to support the new Commonwealth in a way that I think Menzies sometimes struggled with. I could explain that, I think, partly because of these internal relationships that were going on within Canada, and also because of their proximity and relationship to the United States. Too much geography, not enough history. We could say a lot more and a lot more detail, but thank you.
In Afternoon Light, Menzies asserted that he had, quote, attended more Prime Ministers' conference than anyone else. However, as he went on to say, in 1965, he had declined an invitation to the conference held in Lagos to discuss the Commonwealth's responses to Rhodesia's unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI. His refusal to attend was based on his expectation that the conference would debate using armed force against Rhodesia's white minority government. Menzies was critical of the UDI, but opposed to the use of armed force against Rhodesia. He expected that no consensus would emerge from debate on that question in Lagos with other prime ministers. For several years, Menzies had been worried that the Commonwealth was becoming like the United Nations. Anti-racist and anti-colonial norms had recently become dominant in the United Nations General Assembly's understanding of the Charter of the United Nations. In Afternoon Light, Menzies recalled having once presented to Nehru and Nkrumah his strong view that the Conference of Prime Ministers was not, quote, an agent of the United Nations to enforce the Charter. Had he gone to Lagos, Menzies would have found himself up against prime ministers wishing to enforce the UN's anti-racism. When the communique of the Lagos conference referred to Rhodesia's UDI as a rebellion, Menzies saw confirmation of his fear about that gathering. The word rebellion is a word of ill omen, he said. Much of Menzies' diplomacy was multilateral. In this paper, I'll pick out statements by Menzies in which he commented on the relationship between the British Commonwealth of Nations and the United Nations. My first cluster of statements is from 1944 to 1952. And I'm putting all my quotations up for you to see them for yourselves, but I will read them out as well. But unlike other speakers, there are no pictures of distinguished gatherings in London or anywhere else. In July 1944, as Germany defended its western and eastern fronts, Menzies predicted that the peace of the world in 1964, 20 years hence, will depend almost entirely on how the international comradeship in arms of the British Empire, Russia, and the United States of America has been perpetuated as a comradeship in peace. The next year, debating Australia's ratification of the UN Charter, Menzies argued that the UN's ability to secure world peace rested on, quote, an alliance between the United States of America, Great Britain, Russia, China, and France, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And if that alliance stands firm, if those 5 great powers understand each other and concur in the action that they are going to take, world peace will be kept. Although Britain itself, and this is me now, not Menzies, although Britain itself had been weakened by war, it did remain a world power because of the trade and defence policies of the Dominions, not least the material support that both Labor and coalition governments gave to the Sterling area and to the development of Britain's weapons in the 1950s. But the Cold War forced reassessment of great powers' contribution to world peace. In his 1950 Roy Milne lecture, Menzies welcomed Britain's membership of NATO. He deprecated the Security Council as one of the UN's, quote, highly complicated and elaborate paper arrangements. A great power that threatened world peace can be restrained only by another great power, he argued, quote, acting not under the Charter, but independent of it. Australia must continue to make the British Empire, quote, our chief international preoccupation, because the British Commonwealth could curb a threat to world peace and the Security Council could not. In 1952, after Australia signed the ANZUS Pact, Menzies reaffirmed that the British Commonwealth was a great world power. Quote, the peace of the world, he said, depends on the unshakable unity of thought and action of the United States and the British Commonwealth. Then came the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis is significant in my story in 3 ways. Firstly, it damaged trust and understanding between the United States and Great Britain. Secondly, it demonstrated that the nations of the British Commonwealth were not unified in their responses to anti-colonial nationalism. And thirdly, it elicited from Menzies a number of statements in which he again deprecated the multilateralism of the United Nations and praised the multilateralism of the British Commonwealth. And I'm going to give an example of one of those speeches, which I think is given on September the 26th, 1956, which is after General Nasser announced his nationalisation of the canal, but before Israel, Britain, and France attacked Egypt. Menzies gave a speech then that contained three features that are relevant to my theme. First, he presented Nasser's policy as a threat not only to international law, but also to the British Commonwealth. Secondly, Menzies was confirmed in his view that the Security Council, inhibited by the Soviet Union's veto, could not defend international law against Nasser. Thirdly, Menzies contrasted the impotence of the UN with the potential of the British Commonwealth for restorative great power action. And I draw your attention to his language. To rule out using force against Nasser, argued Menzies, was to imagine a world ordered by academic principles. He contrasted this flawed way of thinking with a practical and inductive, his words, approach to international order, whose best example was in the history of the British Empire itself, which he referred to as the lively and evolving history of the British Empire and the British Commonwealth of Nations, with its slow creation of the common law and of all the great instruments of self-government. It would be a sad day if it allowed itself to be theorised out of existence. And in Menzies' language there, you get some characteristic antitheses or binaries in his rhetoric between academic principle on one side, organic development on the other, theorised versus practice, and so forth. These are recurring motifs in Menzies' rhetoric. However, the UN, as we know, with US support, rebuked Britain and France. This baffled Menzies, he said in a later speech. He saw it as a victory for what he called theoretically minded people. After the Suez Crisis, some Australian officials and politicians urged the Menzies government to change its thinking about global politics. The UN's censure of Britain and France provoked officials' reflection on the changing significance of the General Assembly. For example, Sir James Plimsoll in 1857, it wasn't Sir James then, James Plimsoll in 1957 was then Assistant Secretary of the UN Division of the Department of External Affairs. He warned his Australian colleagues in London that the General Assembly, quote, has become a potent means for applying pressure on states, even great states. As the Assembly grew in number, he went on to argue, the USA was seeking to limit Soviet influence over its members. So the USA thought it necessary to, quote, pay lip service to, at least, to anti-colonialism. And as the new nations who were coming into the General Assembly looked to the UN as a forum in which to pursue their interests, the discourse of the UN was changing. And here's a long paragraph from Plimsoll's memorandum. There is a discernible tendency to take positions on a colour basis and to vent anti-European feeling. The Cyprus, Algerian, West New Guinea and apartheid items indicate that lesser political questions of special interest to particular states or groups will also continue to come before the United Nations. The perennial recurrence of certain items on the agenda of the second and third committee, that is the economic development, discrimination, human rights and self-determination matters, is an indication of the political significance they hold for large groups of members. Plimsoll's and other officials' reading of the increasingly anti-colonial and anti-racist mood of the General Assembly contributed to Australia's responses to South Africa's apartheid and to Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence. Menzies was critical of South Africa's apartheid policy, as he made clear in a speech in April 1961. And he anticipated that Rhodesia would eventually have to enfranchise its African population fully. But what Menzies did not support was multilateral pressure on nation states to order their internal affairs in a certain way, and other speakers today have made this point. When South Africa was criticised by motions in the United Nations on its treatment of Indians, on its apartheid policy, and on its policy towards Southwest Africa, Australia rarely voted with South Africa's critics. What Menzies cherished at the meetings among the Prime Ministers of the British Commonwealth was its tolerance for different racial policies of the Commonwealth's member nations. In his 1960 Smuts lecture, Menzies celebrated this tradition by contrasting the Commonwealth and the United Nations. Menzies posed this question to his audience: what are the operative factors which have continued to make the Commonwealth, in spite of all its structural changes, a special association of nations with a mutual relationship which distinguishes it from other world groups? And this was he gave his answer in 2 paragraphs, which I'll show you, describing the ethos of the 2 different multilateral bodies. In the Commonwealth, you have a quality of intimacy, which relegates to the protocol of diplomacy to its proper place, induces personal friendships, and enables us, between conferences, to communicate with each other without hesitation or reserve. When we meet, we have no set agenda, we move no resolutions, and we have never cast votes. We no longer aim at producing a common foreign policy, nor do we any longer find ourselves able to envisage the Commonwealth as a world power. But if we can achieve a common philosophical approach to world problems, there is life and virtue in all our deliberations. We do not meet as a tribunal to sit in judgment upon each other or to ventilate intra-Commonwealth issues. We are not a superstate. He compared this to the atmosphere of the United Nations, where large numbers of delegates to the Assembly meet of necessity, almost as strangers, where of necessity resolutions are tabled, amendments drafted, votes canvassed, and majority decisions taken, where the inevitable bargaining tends to weaken mutual trust. These things must be so in great multinational meetings, where there are no old ties of friendship to preserve, and no great or comprehensive tradition of well-remembered and well-loved association in peace and war. I want to attend now to Menzies' phrase, common philosophical approach to world problems. Was there ever such a thing in the period of Menzies' prime ministership? I want to suggest that there was, and that it was expressed in the international norms that invoked and grew out of the UN Charter and the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By the early 1960s, these were norms of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. To the extent that anti-racism and anti-colonialism became the normative culture of multilateral institutions, they posed 2 challenges that concern me in this paper. One challenge was to the British Commonwealth of Nations, the other was to Australia. The challenge to the Commonwealth was, how would the Commonwealth promote anti-racism and anti-colonialism? Would the Commonwealth hold member nations to account? Menzies said no. He told Nkrumah and Nehru that the Conference of Prime Ministers was, quote, not an agent of the United Nations to enforce the Charter. And in his last year of office, as I've said, he refused an invitation to attend a meeting of Prime Ministers that he feared would resolve that Britain must militarily enforce racial equality in Rhodesia's constitutional development. As early as 1945, Menzies had expressed apprehension about anti-colonial feeling. He made the following comment when speaking to the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party in 1945. The very argument used by those in charge of Australian foreign policy, I refer to the waterside workers, the very arguments used for throwing the Dutch out of the East Indies are the arguments which will be used to throw the British out of Malaysia, to throw the British out of Burma, India, for throwing the Australians out of New Guinea. This is a genius we have for thinking that an argument applying to one set of people cannot apply to another. So he's referring there to an emergent norm, an argument that applies in many cases, a norm of anti-colonialism. As anti-racism and anti-colonialism grew in strength in international norms, the Menzies government became increasingly aware that in three policy domains it was under international scrutiny: the Papua New Guinea mandate, the immigration policy, and the policy towards Aboriginal Australians. Menzies showed his sensitivity to such scrutiny when speaking in response to South Africa's Sharpeville massacre in March 1960. He then told Parliament that for the United Nations and the Commonwealth to censure South Africa would violate a principle that has, quote, done much to keep the British Commonwealth together and to preserve peace in the world. The principle was that one government, I am now talking about governments, does not interfere in matters which are within the domestic jurisdiction of another. To violate that principle, he warned, would legitimise international attention to Australia's policies on, quote, our own native population and on, quote, our own responsibilities in relation to Papua and New Guinea. Apprehension of global criticism of Australia's policies on immigration, Aboriginal rights, and the administration of the UN's Papua New Guinea mandate were very much on the mind of Menzies' Minister for External Affairs, Garfield Barwick, when he considered how to deal with Indonesia. In August 1962, Barwick explained to Duncan Sandys, who was then Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations, why Australia supported Britain's promotion of racial equality in the Commonwealth. Quote, we in Australia wish to gain understanding and support in the United Nations for our New Guinea policies and, like yourselves, to present ourselves to the Afro-Asian world as a liberal country whose objectives for dependent peoples are self-government and eventually independence on the basis of racial equality. Barwick knew that Menzies disliked having to do as Britain was then asking him to do, that is, to advocate racial equality to Rhodesia's white leaders. So, writing to Menzies on the 28th of May 1963, Barwick said that while he too felt for the white settlers who have done so much for Rhodesia, Australia could not afford the luxury of that sympathy. Quote, if it means that Australia, with its migration policy, Papua New Guinea, and our past and, for that matter, present treatment of our Aborigines, is placed in support of a minority white government in Africa, maintained by repressive legislation and perhaps by force of arms. So Menzies' refusal to attend the January 1966 Lagos meeting of Commonwealth Prime Ministers, where Prime Ministers were to discuss Rhodesia, expressed his uneasiness about how to align Australia with the dominant international norms of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. It was reported to Australian officials that Menzies' absence from Lagos elicited, quote, some very nasty Nigerian press comments about racism in Australia. But on the 6th of January 1966, Menzies explained the principle that underlay his not going to Lagos. He said Australia would not participate in a forum that was likely to pressure Britain to use military force against Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence. If such a meeting were to instruct Britain on how to deal with white racism, quote, then Australia can someday be instructed or coerced on some matter in which the sole jurisdiction resides in Australia. So by not attending the last conference of Commonwealth Prime Ministers held during his Prime Ministership, Menzies was defending the sovereignty of Britain and of Australia against a Commonwealth that was becoming more like the United Nations in its assertive anti-colonialism and anti-racism.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.